The air inside the courtroom was heavy, thick with the tension of a trial that had already stretched into its third week. Dust particles floated lazily in the rays of light seeping through the tall, narrow windows. The jury sat stiffly in their chairs, their faces grave, eyes darting between the lawyers who sparred like rival gladiators. Every sound, the scrape of a pen, a shuffle of papers, the faint clearing of a throat seemed amplified in the silence that hovered between bursts of argument. Near the front, the defendant sat hunched at the table beside his attorney. His dark suit was rumpled from long days of testimony, but he wore a mask of confidence he hadn't earned. His eyes, however, betrayed him. They flicked nervously toward the jury, then to the judge, and finally to the people in the gallery, as though searching for an escape route in a place where none existed. Among the spectators was a figure who did not belong, not because she was unwelcome, but because her presence was unexpected. A small girl, no more than 3 years old, sat perched on a wooden bench, her tiny legs dangling several inches above the floor. She wore a yellow dress decorated with small white flowers, her curls pinned back with a matching bow. Her grandmother sat beside her, stroking her arm gently, as though reminding the child to be still. The little girl's eyes, wide and curious, darted around the courtroom. To her, the place felt less like a temple of justice and more like a giant, echoing hall filled with strangers who spoke in voices too loud and words too complicated. She had no understanding of crime or evidence or sentencing. What she understood was much simpler, the sound of her grandmother's heartbeat when she pressed her ear against her chest, the comforting feel of holding her favorite stuffed rabbit, and the way a certain dog's bark had once made her tremble in fear. She shifted in her seat, her small shoes tapping lightly against the bench, as if drumming to a tune only she could hear. No one gave her more than a passing glance. After all, children sometimes appeared in courtrooms, brought by guardians who had no choice, or in rare cases as witnesses in family matters. Still, no one could imagine that this child's presence would carry the weight of an unspoken truth, waiting to break free. The judge's gavel cracked against the sound block, commanding attention. "Order in the court," he said, his voice resonating through the chamber. He was a man of stern composure, his silver hair cropped short, his eyes sharp behind rimless glasses. He had presided over countless cases, seen hardened criminals brought to their knees, and endured hours in meticulous testimony. But even he did not notice the child in the gallery, at least not yet. The prosecutor rose from his seat, pacing deliberately before the jury. His words painted a picture of the night in question, the screams that echoed through a darkened street, the quick response of officers, the chaos that followed. He spoke of evidence footprints, fibers, witnesses whose accounts wavered under pressure. Each point seemed designed to tighten a noose around the defendant's case. The defense attorney countered, his tone measured but confident, chipping away at details, suggesting inconsistencies, planting seeds of doubt where certainty had begun to grow. The jury listened, weighed, and silently judged, their faces masks of neutrality, but their minds already forming opinions they dared not yet reveal. In the middle of this verbal battlefield, the little girl fidgeted. Her grandmother bent down, whispering softly, "She, sweetheart. Just a little longer. Be good for Grandma." The child nodded, but her wide eyes remained fixed on the front of the courtroom, as though waiting for something only she could sense. The minutes ticked by. Lawyers sparred, evidence was read, voices rose and fell. The child began to swing her feet in rhythm, her gaze wandering from the stern judge to the glowering defendant. Something about the man at the table made her grip her grandmother's hand tighter. She couldn't explain it, didn't have the words. But she remembered things in pictures, flashes of sound and color, a night that smelled of smoke and rain, a deep growl that made her cry, and the way her grandmother had carried her away in trembling arms. A clerk entered quietly, handing the prosecutor a document. The jury leaned in again. The trial pressed forward, relentless. But soon, an interruption would shift everything. The back door creaked open. Heads turned briefly, and a uniformed officer walked in, holding a leash. At the other end, padded a large German shepherd, its coat gleaming under the light. The animal moved with disciplined grace, every muscle trained to obey, every step deliberate. Its handler guided it to the side of the courtroom, where it sat obediently, eyes scanning the room. The girl froze. Her tiny fingers dug into her grandmother's hand. She leaned forward, her eyes locked on the dog. To her, it wasn't just a police canine brought in for security. It was the dog. The same one whose bark had shattered the night of terror, still etched into her memory. She remembered its silhouette, the glint of its eyes, the way it had charged forward as voices shouted and chaos erupted. Her lips parted slightly. She wanted to speak, but her voice stuck in her throat. The dog turned its head, sniffing the air, and for one brief second, its gaze met hers. The child's heart raced. "Grandma," she whispered, tugging at the woman's sleeve. Her grandmother, distracted by the proceedings, only patted her arm absently. "Not now, darling." But the little girl could not look away. Her entire small frame stiffened, eyes wide with recognition that no one else in the room seemed to notice. Her mind, still too young to process the gravity of the trial, understood only this: the dog was connected to the night she remembered. And with that realization, something inside her shifted. Her grandmother finally noticed the tension in her grip. "Sweetheart, what's wrong?" she whispered, leaning closer. The girl raised her hand. Slowly, almost hesitantly, she pointed toward the front of the courtroom, her tiny finger aimed directly at the police dog. The grandmother's eyes widened in confusion. "She, darling," she murmured again, trying to lower the child's arm, worried about drawing attention. But the girl's gaze was unwavering. Her small voice trembled as she tried to form words. At first, no one else noticed. The attorneys continued their sparring. The judge leaned forward listening intently, and the jury scribbled notes. But one by one, whispers began to spread as spectators near the back nudged each other, pointing toward the little girl. The movement drew the attention of a court officer, who frowned and turned his gaze to the gallery. And then came the silence. The girl's arm remained extended, her eyes locked on the canine. The handler noticed now, raising a curious brow, tugging the leash slightly, as though to signal the dog to settle. But the dog's ears perked up, its attention momentarily caught by the child's unflinching stare. The grandmother leaned in desperately. "Please, honey, not now. Let's be quiet." But her words went unheard. The little girl inhaled sharply, her chest rising and falling with determination far greater than her years. Her lips began to move. She was about to speak. The atmosphere in the courtroom changed in an instant. The murmurs died down. The judge lifted his gavel, but hesitated, sensing the shift. Lawyers paused mid-sentence, glancing back in irritation that quickly turned to curiosity. The jury looked up from their notes. All eyes turned to the child. The unlikely witness was about to break her silence. The door at the back of the courtroom opened again, this time with more deliberate weight. A hushed ripple passed through the audience as a uniformed officer stepped inside, the faint clink of a metal clasp echoing against the wooden floors. At the end of the leash strode a German shepherd, tall and proud, its coat the deep brown and black of midnight shadows. The dog's presence shifted the mood immediately. For some, it was reassurance, the embodiment of discipline, loyalty, and justice. For others, it was a reminder of the world outside the courtroom walls, raw, unpredictable, and dangerous. The handler, A broad-shouldered officer with a sharp jawline and steady hands walked the canine forward with practiced ease. His eyes scanned the room as if gauging its reaction. He had done this dozens of times before. To him, the animal was not merely a dog, but a partner, trained to track, to protect, to intimidate when necessary. A judge gave a small nod of acknowledgement. The jury shifted uncomfortably, some leaning away slightly as the shepherd padded past them, its nails clicking lightly against the polished floor. The defendant's face twitched with unease. Though he tried to mask it, his gaze lingered too long on the dog, betraying a flicker of recognition or fear. In the gallery, the little girl sat frozen. Her grandmother felt the change immediately. The child's tiny hand tightened like a vice around her wrist. She looked down, expecting perhaps that the child was frightened by the size of the animal. But what she saw in her granddaughter's eyes was not simple fear. It was recognition. The dog stopped near the prosecution's table, sitting obediently at the handler's side. Its ears twitched, nose twitching as it caught scents in the air. The handler gave a firm command in a low voice, and the shepherd's tail thumped once against the floor before it stilled completely, eyes alert, chest rising steadily. The little girl could not tear her gaze away. Images raced through her mind, unbidden but sharp. A dark street glistening with rain. The sound of her grandmother shouting her name. The sudden burst of a flashlight cutting across shadows. And then the deep, growl-low rumbling, vibrating through her small chest, the exact same sound that had once terrified her. She remembered clinging to her grandmother's coat, her cheeks wet with tears, as this very dog had lunged forward in the chaos of that night. Her lips trembled. She wanted to tell her grandmother, to say it out loud, but her voice was trapped somewhere between fear and certainty. Across the room, the prosecutor adjusted his notes, speaking once again to the jury. His voice filled the chamber, but it no longer seemed to command the same attention. The presence of the dog had drawn eyes away, like a magnet pulling at the edges of a compass. Even the judge leaned back in his chair, watching with an expression that mixed curiosity with careful control. The defendant's attorney shifted in his seat, his eyes narrowing as he studied the animal. He whispered something to his client, who responded with a stiff shake of the head. Their quiet exchange went unnoticed by most except for the jury, who were always watching more closely than they appeared. Then, almost imperceptibly, the German shepherd turned its head. Its dark, intelligent eyes swept across the room before settling directly on the little girl. Her breath caught in her throat. She pressed herself closer to her grandmother's side, her tiny fingers clutching fabric so tightly her knuckles paled. The dog's gaze was steady, unblinking, as though it too recognized her. It tilted its head slightly, ears flicking forward. The handler noticed and frowned. He gave a quiet command, tugging gently on the leash. The dog obeyed, looking away, but the moment had not gone unseen. A murmur spread among the spectators, faint but rising, as people noticed the child's wide eyes and trembling lip. "Sweetheart?" her grandmother whispered, crouching down slightly to meet her gaze. "What is it? Are you afraid of the dog?" The girl shook her head slowly. Then, after a pause, she whispered something so faint, her grandmother had to lean in close to hear. "Same one." The words chilled her grandmother. She blinked rapidly, uncertain she'd heard correctly. "What do you mean, darling?" she asked, brushing a strand of hair from the child's forehead. The girl's eyes never left the shepherd. Her finger twitched as though it longed to point, but fear held it back. She repeated softly, "Same one." Her grandmother's pulse quickened. She glanced around nervously, hoping no one else had noticed. But too late, several spectators in the nearest rows had caught the girl's whisper. They exchanged startled glances, nudging each other as if they had stumbled upon a secret revelation. The dog shifted again, its gaze pulling back toward the child, as if responding to her recognition. The handler gave another firm command, trying to keep his partner focused. But the strange connection was undeniable now. The prosecutor stopped mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing. He had caught the movement, the whispers, the ripple of energy in the gallery. His gaze darted toward the child, then to the dog, then back to the child again. His instincts told him something important had just happened. The judge noticed as well. His gavel tapped lightly against the sound block. "Is there an issue in the gallery?" His voice was firm, but curious. The grandmother swallowed hard. "No, Your Honor," she said quickly, her cheeks flushing. She pulled the child closer, whispering, "Please, sweetheart, be quiet." But the child could not be quiet. Her little heart pounded, her memory sparking like lightning against a dark sky. She knew this dog. She remembered the way its bark had shattered the night, the way its paws had splashed through puddles as officers shouted. And she remembered what came after, something too big for her small mind to explain, but vivid enough to remain. The handler looked uneasy now, his brow furrowed. He recognized the signs. The girl wasn't just curious or scared, she knew the dog. But how? The defense attorney noticed too, leaning toward the judge. "Your Honor, is this distraction necessary? The presence of the canine is prejudicial at this stage." His voice dripped with irritation, but also thinly veiled concern. The judge waved him off. "The court allows the presence of the canine for security. Proceed." But the courtroom had already shifted. All it took was a child's unflinching stare to unearth attention no one expected. The little girl's presence, once overlooked, was now impossible to ignore. She finally lifted her arm. Her grandmother tried to stop her, but the child's determination was stronger. Her tiny finger rose, steady this time, pointing directly at the police dog. Gasps erupted softly in the gallery. The handler froze. The prosecutor stood straighter. The judge leaned forward. The dog, as though sensing the weight of the moment, did not move. Its eyes locked once again with the child's, and for a breathless instant, the courtroom seemed to hold still. The little girl's lips began to part, her small voice ready to break the silence. The entrance of the canine had changed everything. The hush that followed her raised finger seemed to stretch into eternity. The courtroom, once filled with the steady rhythm of arguments and the scrape of pens on paper, fell into a suffocating silence. Every head turned toward the little girl seated halfway down the gallery. Her small arm, delicate as porcelain, remained outstretched. Her tiny index finger, trembling only slightly, was aimed squarely at the German shepherd sitting at its handler's side. The grandmother's face drained of color. She pulled at the child's arm, whispering harshly under her breath, "No, darling, not now. Please put your hand down." But the girl resisted, her gaze locked on the canine, as if something deep inside her refused to be silenced. The judge's gavel rapped sharply. "Order." His voice rang with authority, but curiosity sharpened its edges. He leaned forward, peering over his glasses at the gallery. "What is the meaning of this interruption?" Whispers rippled through the benches, like the rustling of leaves before a storm. Spectators nudged one another, their eyes darting between the child and the dog. Some looked bewildered, others intrigued. The jury, too, had turned, abandoning their notes to follow the small drama unfolding before them. The prosecutor was the first to act. He stepped forward, his brows furrowed, trying to mask his sudden interest beneath a facade of professional calm. "Your Honor, if I may," he said, "perhaps we should allow the gallery to settle before we proceed." His words were cautious, but his mind raced. He had seen many strange moments in courtrooms, but never a toddler interrupting proceedings with such fierce intent. The defense attorney rose quickly, his tone clipped. Your Honor, this is precisely the kind of distraction I warned against. A child barely old enough to speak should not be allowed to derail a trial of this gravity. I move we dismiss this disturbance at once. But dismissing the moment was impossible. The energy in the room had shifted, pulled into the orbit of the little girl's unshakable stare. The handler of the canine shifted uneasily, tugging lightly on the leash. The dog, however, did not move. Its ears pricked forward, eyes locked on the child, as though acknowledging her recognition. The German shepherd's training had honed it to detect fear, anger, and familiarity. What it sensed now was unusual. The girl's lips trembled, but she made no sound. Her arm wavered slightly, but her finger never strayed from its target. Finally, in a voice soft but unmistakably clear, she whispered, "That one." The words were fragile, floating through the courtroom like a feather, yet they landed with the weight of stone. The grandmother's heart clenched. She bent low, whispering frantically, "Hush, darling. You don't know what you're saying. Be quiet now." But her granddaughter pulled away, eyes never leaving the dog. "That one," she repeated, louder this time. Her tiny voice, innocent yet firm, carried across the silent chamber. Gasps broke out among the spectators. The defendant stiffened in his seat, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the table. His attorney's jaw tightened, and he leaned in to whisper something, but the man shook his head violently, as though trying to deny the panic rising in his chest. The prosecutor's pulse quickened. He exchanged a sharp glance with the handler, who looked pale, his brows knitted in confusion. It wasn't common, but it wasn't impossible. Children remembered things adults tried to bury. The judge's gavel struck again. Order in the court. Silence. His booming voice restored a semblance of discipline, but even he could not hide the curiosity in his tone. He turned his sharp gaze on the grandmother. "Madame, please explain what is happening here. Why is this child pointing at the K9? The grandmother opened her mouth, then faltered. Words tangled in her throat. What could she say? That her granddaughter had been there, had seen things no 3-year-old should ever see? That she had prayed for weeks the child's memories would fade into the blur of toddlerhood? She stammered, "Your Honor, she's just a child. She doesn't know what she's doing." But the judge was not convinced. He shifted his gaze to the prosecutor. "Mr. Hayes, what is the meaning of this? Did the state intend for this child to be present here today?" The prosecutor hesitated. "No, Your Honor. She is not on our witness list." He paused, then added, "But if the court permits, I believe it may be worth clarifying why she recognizes the animal." The defense attorney slammed a hand on his desk. "Objection. This is outrageous. We will not allow a 3-year-old to give unsworn testimony in the middle of trial. This is nothing but a stunt to sway the jury." His voice cracked with thinly veiled desperation. But the jury was already swayed. Their eyes followed the little girl, their expressions softening at the innocence of her words. No amount of legal jargon could erase the purity of a child's recognition. The judge raised a hand. "Objection noted. However, the court will not ignore a direct interruption of this nature. Proceed carefully, Mr. Hayes. One question only." The prosecutor nodded solemnly. He approached the gallery slowly, crouching slightly to meet the girl's eye level without looming. His tone softened, stripped of its courtroom sharpness. "Hello there," he said gently. "What's your name?" The girl clutched her grandmother's sleeve but answered, "Maddie." "Maddie," he repeated kindly. "You pointed at the dog. Can you tell us why?" The grandmother squeezed her hand, whispering, "Don't, darling, please." But the girl's young face set in determination. She pointed again, her voice trembling but steady enough to carry. "Same dog. I saw him. That night." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. The handler's eyes widened. He knew exactly which night she meant. His canine had been deployed on the night of the crime, the night everything unraveled. The defense attorney shot to his feet. This is inadmissible. She's a toddler, for God's sake. She doesn't understand. Sit down, Mr. Crane, the judge snapped, his gavel striking once more. His voice was cold steel now, cutting through the chaos. The court will decide what carries weight. For now, we have heard enough. But the jury had heard too. They had seen the finger, the wide, innocent eyes, the uncoached certainty in her voice. It was not the ramblings of a confused child. It was memory. Raw, undeniable memory. The defendant shifted in his seat, sweat forming at his temples. He glanced toward the gallery, his jaw clenched so tightly, his teeth ground audibly. For the first time since the trial began, a mask of arrogance cracked. The little girl, oblivious to the storm she had unleashed, lowered her hand and leaned against her grandmother's arm, her small body exhausted by the effort. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "Doggy was there." The silence that followed was suffocating. The judge finally cleared his throat, breaking the spell. This court will recess for 15 minutes. Counsel approached the bench immediately. The gavel struck again, but the sound could not erase the truth that now hung over the room. A 3-year-old, with a pointed finger and a few simple words, had shaken the trial to its core. The courtroom settled into an uneasy silence as the recess ended. The gavel's sharp crack echoed like a rifle shot, pulling everyone back into their seats. But though the judge's voice called for order, no one truly returned to their previous composure. The jurors leaned forward, whispering faintly to one another before falling quiet. The defendant sat rigid at the table, jaw tight, eyes darting nervously toward the gallery where the child now rested in her grandmother's lap. The grandmother stroked her granddaughter's hair, whispering soothing words that carried more desperation than comfort. The girl Maddie seemed calm now, but her eyes still followed the police dog with unwavering attention. The German shepherd sat patiently at its handler's side, but the air between them and the child pulsed with a tension no one could ignore. The judge cleared his throat. "Let us proceed," he said, though even he sounded less assured than before. The jury is reminded that unsworn testimony carries no legal weight. You will base your decision on evidence presented properly in this court. His words were precise, but they did little to erase the memory of the child's pointed finger. The prosecutor rose slowly, hesitating. He could feel the defense attorney's glare boring into him, daring him to push further. But instincts honed from years of chasing truth urged him on. He stepped forward. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would like to clarify something." The defense attorney leapt up. "Absolutely not. This child is not a witness. She is not competent to testify. We cannot allow these proceedings to dissolve into a circus." The judge lifted his hand, silencing them both. His eyes flicked toward the girl, then back to the attorneys. After a long pause, he said, "One question. Only one. Then we move on." The prosecutor nodded gravely, then turned to the gallery. He approached slowly, crouching once more to meet the girl's gaze. His tone softened to a whisper, meant only for her, though the silence of the courtroom allowed every syllable to carry. "Maddie," he said gently, "you pointed at the dog. You told us you saw him that night. Can you tell us? What do you remember?" Her grandmother's arms tightened around her, but the girl's small body wriggled free. She sat upright, her little face pale but determined. For a moment, she said nothing. Her lips pressed together, as though she were trying to decide whether the truth inside her belonged in this room, filled with strangers. The shepherd shifted slightly, a quiet huff of breath escaping its muzzle. Maddie's eyes flicked to the dog again, and then she spoke. "Doggy, bad." The words were soft. They could have been mistaken for a child's misunderstanding. But the way she said them, clear, deliberate, as though she had practiced them in the safety of her dreams, sent a jolt through every person in the room. The grandmother froze. Her face crumpled, torn between fear and heartbreak. She pressed a trembling hand to her granddaughter's cheek, whispering desperately, "No, baby, no. That's enough." But Maddie shook her head. Her eyes filled with a strange mixture of fear and certainty, far older than her 3 years. She repeated it louder, her voice steady this time. "Doggy bad." Gasps swept through the gallery like a wave breaking against rocks. A reporter's pen scratched furiously against his notepad. A juror pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes wide. The defense attorney nearly toppled his chair as he jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, this is absurd. She's parroting words she doesn't even understand. This must not be considered." The prosecutor stayed still, his gaze locked on the child, his heart pounding. He hadn't known what she would say, but something in her voice cut deeper than any evidence he had prepared. The judge rapped his gavel furiously. "Order! Order in this courtroom!" His voice carried authority, but his eyes betrayed the same shock everyone else felt. The handler's grip on the dog's leash tightened. He glanced down at his partner, who now sat unnervingly still, ears pricked forward. He remembered that night clearly. The shepherd had been released into the alley, its bark piercing the darkness, its jaws clamping down to stop a fleeing man. That deployment had been documented in his report, but no child had ever been mentioned in connection to it. Until now. Maddie's grandmother buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. She had prayed for months that the child's memories would fade, that her granddaughter would forget the chaos, the barking, the screaming. But the truth had burned itself too deeply into her small mind. The defendant shifted violently in his chair. His attorney grabbed his arm, whispering harshly, but the man's face betrayed him. A sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead, his lips pressed into a thin line. His composure was unraveling. The prosecutor finally stood, addressing the judge with deliberate calm. "Your Honor, the state does not ask the jury to consider this as sworn testimony. But let the record reflect. This child, uncoached, unprompted, recognized the K-9 and recalled its role in the events of that night." The defense attorney pounded the table. "She's a toddler. Toddlers repeat things they hear. She could have overheard something. This is prejudicial." The judge slammed his gavel again. "Enough, both of you." He turned his gaze to the jury, his tone stern. "You are reminded that the child's words are not formal evidence. You will disregard them in your deliberations." But his command was futile. Everyone in the room knew the truth. Words once spoken could not be unheard. And these words, two simple ones, uttered from the mouth of a child, carried more power than hours of lawyerly argument. The prosecutor returned to his seat, his face unreadable. Inside, however, he knew the tide had shifted. The jurors' faces told him everything. They might nod at the judge's instructions, but their hearts and minds had already absorbed the child's truth. Maddie slumped back against her grandmother's shoulder, her duty done. Her small frame trembled with exhaustion, but her eyes were calm now. She had said what she needed to say. The courtroom might not understand the depth of her memory, but she had given them a piece of it, a piece so simple it could not be twisted or debated. "Doggy bad?" The judge sighed heavily, pinching the bridge of his nose. He looked weary, older somehow, as though the innocence of the moment had pierced even his hardened exterior. He dismissed the jury for the evening, his gavel falling one last time. As the room emptied, conversations buzzed like bees in a hive. Reporters jostled for position, eager to capture every detail. Spectators shook their heads in disbelief. Some whispered prayers, others exchanged theories. The defendant slumped in his chair, his mask of confidence shattered. His attorney leaned close, whispering furiously, but his eyes remained fixed on the little girl. The handler led the shepherd out of the courtroom, his steps heavy. He knew tonight he would replay her words over and over in his head, questioning what the child had seen and how deeply the dog's bark had carved itself into her memory. And in the gallery, as her grandmother gathered their things, Maddie leaned her head against her shoulder and whispered one last time, softly but with finality, "Doggy bad." The grandmother's eyes filled with tears. She kissed the top of the child's head, realizing that innocence could sometimes reveal truths adults struggled to face. The courtroom had expected another long day of testimony. Instead, it had been shattered by 2 words from the smallest voice in the room, words that no one would ever forget. The gavel's echo still lingered in the air, but the silence it commanded was fragile at best. Conversations spilled into hushed whispers, eyes darting toward the small child, whose 2 words had cut sharper than any piece of evidence presented over the last week. The bailiff moved to escort the jury out, and the scrape of chairs filled the courtroom. Some jurors cast backward glances as they shuffled toward the door, their expressions conflicted. The judge's order had been clear: disregard the child's utterance. Yet the human heart was not so easily instructed. Maddie's small, unwavering declaration, "Doggy bad," had lodged itself firmly in their minds. At the prosecution table, Samuel Green shuffled his papers, though his mind was elsewhere. He replayed the moment over and over: the girl's pointed finger, her clear voice, the sudden shift in the atmosphere. Years in the courtroom had taught him to read jurors, to sense when truth had pierced their professional detachment. And truth had walked in wearing a child's face today. Across the aisle, defense attorney Richard Cole whispered urgently to his client. The defendant, Travis Mercer, stared straight ahead, his jaw locked tight, sweat trickling down the side of his face. Richard tugged at his sleeve. "Stay calm," he hissed. "We can spin this. She's a child. No one will believe her." But Travis's eyes betrayed a flicker of panic. He had built his defense on silence, on technicalities, on the belief that the system could not connect him to that night. Now a 3-year-old had cracked through the wall he thought impenetrable. The judge rose from his bench, robes sweeping as he disappeared into chambers. The courtroom emptied slowly, like a theater after a performance that left the audience unsettled. Reporters rushed into the hallway, phones pressed to their ears, already dictating headlines. Toddler stuns court with 2 words. K9 recognition raises questions in Mercer trial. But inside the room, not everyone left. The handler of the German shepherd, Officer Daniels, lingered near the back. His partner, Rex, sat obediently at his side, but even the dog seemed unsettled. Daniels could still see Maddie's eyes, wide and certain, as they fixed on Rex. He crouched down beside the dog, stroking his fur absently. "What did she see, boy?" he muttered under his breath. "What did you show her that night?" Rex offered no answer, only a soft whine. But Daniels's own memories filled the silence. He remembered the chaos, the shouting, the chase through the alley, the moment Rex lunged and brought Mercer down. It had been a textbook deployment, one Daniels had logged without hesitation. Yet something gnawed at him, a detail left unspoken, something small but significant. And if the child remembered it, the jury might too. Meanwhile, Maddie's grandmother Evelyn struggled to comfort the little girl. She held her close, whispering soothing words, but Maddie's mind was far from comfort. She had seen Rex before. She remembered the barking, the flashing lights, the fear pressing down on her chest as she hid behind a trash bin that night. In her tiny mind, Rex was not a hero. He was the sound of terror itself. As they gathered their belongings, Samuel Green approached, careful not to frighten the child. He leaned toward Evelyn, lowering his voice. "Mrs. Lane, I need to ask you something. Did Maddie ever mention the dog before today?" Evelyn's eyes flickered nervously. She hesitated, then shook her head. "She has nightmares sometimes. She says things. I never told her what it meant. She's only 3. I thought," her voice cracked, "I thought she'd forget." Samuel's chest tightened. Forgetting was the shield many families prayed for in the aftermath of trauma. But this child had remembered, and in remembering, she had illuminated something crucial. That evening, in the quiet of his office, Samuel reopened the police reports. He scanned Daniels' statements, every line about Rex's deployment. Standard phrasing, nothing out of place. But the child's reaction told him there was more. He circled one sentence. Suspect apprehended near alleyway. No civilians present. No civilians present. And yet, a 3-year-old had been there. A child who had seen enough to point at the Kai 9 months later in a courtroom filled with strangers. If the report was wrong, what else had been overlooked? The next morning, the courtroom was buzzing before the judge even entered. News cameras had crowded the courthouse steps. The jurors filed in, their faces tight with curiosity. Everyone wanted to know, what would happen after yesterday's shock? Officer Daniels was called back to the stand. He adjusted his uniform, sat stiffly, and folded his hands. The prosecutor rose, eyes sharp. "Officer Daniels, I'd like to revisit your report from the night in question." Daniels nodded cautiously. "You stated in your report there were no civilians present during the deployment of your K-9 partner. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir," Daniels replied. "And yet yesterday, a 3-year-old child recognized your dog. She identified him from that night. How do you explain that?" A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Daniels swallowed hard. His gaze drifted toward Rex, waiting patiently in the hallway with another officer. "Children remember things differently," he said carefully. "Maybe she saw the dog another time." Samuel pressed. "Are you certain, officer? Because if that child was present, then your report is incomplete. And if your report is incomplete, the jury deserves to know why." Daniels shifted uncomfortably. He remembered the girl now, the fleeting glimpse of movement behind a dumpster. He had brushed it aside in the adrenaline of the moment, focusing only on the suspect. But the truth gnawed at him. He could lie, preserve the integrity of his report. Or he could speak the truth and risk unraveling the case. His throat tightened. Finally, he said, "There may have been a child in the alley. I saw movement, but it wasn't clear. My priority was apprehending the suspect." The courtroom erupted. The defense attorney sprang to his feet. "So your report was false? You withheld information?" Daniels's face flushed red. "I didn't withhold. I didn't know for certain. My focus was on Mercer. But the damage was done." The jurors whispered furiously. The judge banged his gavel, and the prosecutor stood taller. The recognition of the K-9 had opened a door. Through that door now spilled doubt, memory, and the haunting truth of what a child had seen. And in the gallery, Maddie clutched her grandmother's hand tightly, her wide eyes watching the man who had once loomed over her in the shadows of an alley. She didn't understand the weight of her words, nor the chaos they had unleashed. She only knew what she remembered. Doggy bad. 2 words that had begun to unravel, lies carefully bound by legal language. 2 words that revealed more truth than pages of sworn testimony. And as the proceedings wore on, it became clear to everyone, jury, judge, and counsel alike, that the smallest witness had just become the most powerful voice in the room. The courtroom was no longer a sanctuary of order and solemnity. It throbbed with energy, each heartbeat echoing the revelation that had just cracked open the case. The jurors, once composed and detached, leaned forward now with sharpened interest. Their notebooks were no longer idle props. Pens scratched furiously across the paper, as if trying to capture every twist of the unraveling story. The judge, his patience tested, leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming against the bench. He had seen trials swerve unexpectedly before, but this was unprecedented. A 3-year-old's 2 words had shifted the axis of the proceedings. And now, a decorated officer had admitted his report was incomplete. It was no longer a question of whether the trial had turned. The only question left was how far it would spiral. Samuel Green, the prosecutor, felt the weight of the moment pressing against his chest. He knew instinct alone wasn't enough to win a trial. Juries required clarity, evidence, and a narrative that bound all loose threads together. And here, out of the mouth of a child, a thread had been tugged, unraveling months of carefully rehearsed defenses. He stood and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, in light of Officer Daniels's testimony and the child's spontaneous recognition, the state requests a brief recess to review additional evidence. It is now clear that there are details from the night of the incident that may not have been fully considered." The defense attorney exploded. "This is outrageous. The state has had months to build its case. They can't suddenly decide to reshuffle evidence just because a toddler had a bad dream and recognized a police dog." But Samuel pressed on, his voice calm but unyielding. "The state has a duty to pursue truth wherever it leads. If a child's memory shines light on something overlooked, it is our responsibility to follow that lead." The judge's gavel struck the block. "Enough. I will allow a recess. 30 minutes. But let me remind both parties, this trial will not devolve into theatrics. Bring me facts, or don't bring me anything at all." The court adjourned temporarily. The buzz of conversation erupted immediately, like a storm contained within 4 walls. Jurors exchanged glances. Reporters sprinted out into the hallway. Evelyn held Maddie close, whispering promises of ice cream and cartoons once this confusing nightmare was over. But Samuel did not waste a second. He hurried with his team into a nearby conference room, his mind whirring. "Pull the surveillance tapes again," he ordered. "Every camera from the alley that night. I don't care if we've combed them before. Look for signs of anyone else, especially a child." An investigator clicked away on his laptop. Another reviewed logs from the evidence locker. Samuel paced, his thoughts racing. If Maddie had been there that night, even in hiding, then the entire timeline could shift. The defense's argument that Mercer had been wrongly identified might collapse under the weight of her recognition. And yet Samuel's stomach churned. The presence of a child in that alley also raised troubling questions. Why had Daniels overlooked her? Had procedures been compromised? Would the defense now weaponize the department's oversight to create reasonable doubt? Across the hall, Richard Cole seethed. He paced like a caged animal, his tie loosened, his face flushed with fury. They're using a toddler's babble to dismantle months of work. He snapped at Mercer. "Do you understand how insane this is?" Mercer slumped in his chair, his hands clenched into fists. His cool facade had fractured, and Richard knew it. The jurors had seen it too. If the case was about impressions, then Mercer's guilt had already seeped into the air like smoke no one could ignore. The recess ended quickly. The judge returned, robes flowing, and order was called once more. Samuel rose with a stack of papers in his hand. His team had worked furiously to pull archived files, and what they found was damning. "Your Honor," Samuel began, his voice steady but electric with conviction, "the state has reviewed surveillance footage from the night of the arrest, and we discovered something previously overlooked. A figure small, child-sized, can be seen darting into the shadows moments before the defendant was apprehended. The defense attorney leapt to his feet. Objection. This footage was already reviewed. The state is cherry-picking shadows to fit their narrative. A judge motioned for call. Overruled. The jury will view the footage. The lights dimmed slightly as the video was projected onto the courtroom screen. The grainy black and white footage played out. Mercer sprinting down the alley, Rex lunging at him, Daniels following close behind. Then, for a fraction of a second, a blur at the edge of the frame small. Quick, ducking behind a dumpster. The room erupted. Jurors whispered to one another. Reporters scrambled to jot down every detail. Evelyn gasped, her hand clutching her chest, while Maddie watched the screen with wide, unblinking eyes. Samuel turned to the jury. That blur is not imagination. That is Maddie Lane. That is why she recognized the canine. She was there. She saw everything. The defense attorney objected again, his voice cracking with desperation. That could be anyone. A trick of the light, a stray cat, anything. But the seed had been planted. The jurors had seen the figure with their own eyes, and they could not unsee it. Officer Daniels sat rigid in the witness chair, shame heavy in his gut. He had failed to report the possibility of a civilian. He had failed to protect a child that night. His heart ached as he looked at Maddie, who now buried her face against her grandmother's shoulder. The judge, though visibly unsettled, allowed the footage to remain in evidence. The jury will give this video the weight it deems appropriate. His gavel struck once, but it did little to contain the chaos now swirling through the courtroom. For the prosecution, the momentum was undeniable. Maddie's 2 words had cracked the case, and now the video evidence reinforced it. For the defense, the strategy was unraveling. They could no longer argue that Mercer had been misidentified, or that the dog had attacked the wrong man. A child's memory, fragile but hauntingly accurate, had tied Mercer irrevocably to that night. And for the jury, the turning point had arrived. They had come into this trial prepared to weigh cold evidence, but now they carried the voice of a child and the shadow of her memory. Facts and emotions collided in their minds, weaving together into a narrative that could not be dismissed. As the judge adjourned for the day, tension lingered in the air like static before a storm. The jurors filed out, their expressions grim but resolute. Evelyn carried Maddie in her arms, whispering words of comfort, though her own eyes brimmed with tears. Samuel remained at his table, staring at the now blank screen. He knew tomorrow would bring new battles, but tonight he allowed himself a moment of quiet victory. The truth had found its way into the light. And somewhere deep in her child's heart, Maddie felt a sliver of peace. She had spoken. She had been heard. And though she did not know it, her small voice had just shifted the weight of justice forever. The air inside the courtroom felt heavier than ever before. It was as if the very walls themselves had absorbed the shock of the previous day's revelations and now pressed inward, forcing everyone to breathe the same dense, unyielding truth. The jurors sat stiffly in their box, notebooks clasped tightly in their laps, as though holding on to them might anchor them amid the storm of evidence, memory, and innocence colliding around them. Judge Whitaker adjusted his glasses and stared across the sea of restless faces. For decades, he had presided over trials ranging from petty thefts to capital cases. He thought he had seen it all: perjured witnesses, emotional outbursts, jury members fainting under pressure. But never, not once, had he seen a 3-year-old child alter the course of a trial with 2 words and the silent validation of a grainy video. He rapped his gavel sharply. Order! This courtroom will maintain order. The words rang hollow. The undercurrent of tension was far stronger than any command. Samuel Green, the prosecutor, rose with a slow, deliberate motion. His voice carried a calm authority that contrasted with the storm raging outside the courthouse, where reporters had gathered like vultures, circling fresh carrion. "Your Honor, members of the jury," he began. "Yesterday you heard testimony that may have shaken you. Today, I will present corroboration. You saw the footage. You saw that small figure in the alley. You know now that this case is not merely about a suspect and an officer. It is about a child. A child who, despite her age, remembers enough to identify the truth." A murmur rippled through the courtroom gallery. Evelyn, holding Maddie close, bowed her head and prayed silently. Her granddaughter sat quietly, small fingers clutching the hem of her grandmother's sleeve, eyes wide as she studied the room without fully understanding its gravity. The defense attorney, Richard Cole, stood abruptly, his voice rising with a mix of indignation and desperation. "This is unconscionable. The prosecution is exploiting a child's fear to sway the jury. My client has the right to a fair trial, not a circus. We cannot let sentiment override reason." The judge's gavel cracked down again. "Mr. Cole, you will speak in turn. Sit down." But the jurors had already seen Cole's panic, and panic was rarely the face of truth. They had seen Mercer, too, who sat hunched at the defense table, his face pale, sweat dampening the collar of his shirt. His eyes darted not toward the prosecution or the judge, but toward Maddie herself. It was as though he could feel her gaze cutting into him, a memory he had tried to bury returning with the force of a hammer. Samuel turned his focus back to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we are dealing with here is not coincidence." The recognition of the K-9 was immediate and instinctive. The child did not hesitate. Her memory pierced the courtroom like lightning. Why? Because she was there. Because she saw what no one thought she could. That moment when she pointed at Rex and said, "Doggy bad," was the unfiltered truth from a voice untainted by agendas or lies. Cole shot to his feet again, his face flushed. The prosecution is turning a child into an oracle. She is 3 years old. She cannot distinguish fantasy from reality. You can't send a man to prison based on nursery babble. This time, Judge Whitaker didn't silence him immediately. He let the words hang in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. The jurors shifted in their seats, some frowning, others scribbling notes furiously. When the silence had stretched long enough, the judge leaned forward, his voice low and commanding. "Mr. Cole, sit down. This jury will determine what weight, if any, to assign to the child's recognition. The state may proceed." The defense attorney obeyed, but his face betrayed the cracks forming in his composure. He adjusted his tie, tapped his pen against the table, and avoided the jurors' eyes. Samuel, steady and relentless, introduced a new witness, a neighbor from the street near the alley where Mercer had been apprehended. The man, middle-aged and unassuming, testified that he had heard a child crying that night high-pitched sobs that echoed between the brick walls of the alley. At the time, he thought it was the sound of a television in one of the apartments. But now, after hearing Maddie's words, he realized what he had dismissed. The testimony landed like a second strike of thunder. The jurors' eyes widened, pens froze mid-sentence. Evelyn gasped audibly, clutching Maddie tighter. Even Judge Whitaker's brow furrowed with visible concern. Samuel concluded with a firm nod. The child was there. She saw, she remembered. And she has told us in the only way she knows how. The defense scrambled. Cole stood, his voice shaking as he cross-examined the neighbor. "So you heard crying. How do you know it wasn't a stray cat? How do you know it wasn't an echo from a television? You assume now because of the spectacle in this courtroom, don't you?" The neighbor shook his head firmly. "I know the sound of a child crying. I've raised 3 of my own. That was no television. That was a scared little girl. Cole's shoulders slumped as he returned to his table. His words were brittle now, breaking under the weight of testimony and the unshakable image of Maddie's finger pointing toward Rex. The jury had felt it, a moment of raw humanity that transcended legal technicalities. Maddie wasn't trying to win a case. She wasn't trying to craft a narrative. She was simply remembering, and her memory was truth. By the afternoon, the tension had boiled over into the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously. Sketch artists captured Maddie's small, solemn figure, and whispers hissed like wind through the pews. One woman dabbed her eyes with a tissue. Another shook her head in disbelief, muttering, "God help that little girl." The defendant, meanwhile, grew restless. Mercer tapped his fingers against the table, clenched his jaw, and finally snapped. He slammed his palms against the wood, startling everyone in the room. His voice rang out, loud and trembling. "She doesn't know what she's talking about. She's just a kid. She doesn't know what happened." The explosion was immediate. Gasps filled the courtroom. The bailiff stepped forward, and the judge's gavel came down hard. "Mr. Mercer, sit down and remain silent, or I will have you removed from this courtroom." But it was too late. The outburst had betrayed more than panic. It reeked of guilt. The jurors' eyes locked onto Mercer, reading his fear as confession. His lawyer placed a desperate hand on his shoulder, but the damage was done. Maddie, startled by the noise, buried her face against her grandmother's shoulder. Evelyn stroked her hair, whispering soothing words, though her own heart raced with fear and vindication. By the time the court adjourned for the day, the balance had shifted irreversibly. The jurors no longer looked at Mercer as an accused man possibly innocent. They looked at him as a guilty man cornered by the truth of a child's memory. In the hallway, reporters clamored for statements, cameras flashing like lightning storms. "Toddler becomes star witness," blared across digital headlines before nightfall. Analysts debated the legal implications, some scoffing at the reliance on a child's words, others marveling at the undeniable human weight they carried. Inside the courthouse, though, everyone felt it in their bones. The tide had turned. The courtroom was no longer a battleground of technical arguments. It had become a theater of truth, stripped bare, spoken from the mouth of a child too young to understand the power she wielded. The next day promised closing arguments, but the real verdict had already begun to form in the minds of the jury. Maddie's 2 words had set the stage, the video had reinforced it, and Mercer's outburst had sealed it. And as Evelyn carried her granddaughter out into the night, Maddie whispered once more, soft but certain, the words that had never left her since that night in the alley. "Doggy bad." The grandmother hugged her close. For all the chaos it had caused, for all the fear it had rekindled, she understood one thing. Those 2 words were more powerful than all the pages of legal jargon stacked high in that courtroom. They were truth. And truth, once spoken, could never be silenced. The morning of the final day dawned heavy and gray. The courthouse loomed like a fortress against the low-hanging clouds, its stone facade streaked with rain. Reporters clustered at the steps, umbrellas colliding as they jostled for position. The trial had become a national spectacle overnight. The story of a toddler pointing at a police dog and speaking 2 words had spread across headlines like wildfire. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Jurors filed into their box with expressions carved from stone, their duty pressing heavily upon them. The gallery was packed to capacity. Strangers leaned forward, holding their breath, hungry for closure. Evelyn sat quietly near the front. Maddie nestled against her lap, her tiny hand clutching the silver locket around her grandmother's neck. Judge Whitaker entered and struck his gavel. The room fell silent instantly. "We will now hear closing arguments." His tone carried the solemn gravity of a man who understood the weight of history pressing down upon his courtroom. Samuel Green rose first. His every movement was measured, his voice deliberate. He looked directly at the jury, his eyes scanning each face. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "over the past days, you have heard evidence, testimony, and arguments. But none struck you as profoundly as the moment a 3-year-old child pointed to a police K-9 and said 2 words, 'doggy bad.' You saw the recognition in her eyes. You saw the way it shook this courtroom. That was not rehearsed, not prompted, not manipulated. That was memory. Innocent, uncorrupted memory." He paused, letting silence settle, letting the jurors absorb the words. She was there that night. She heard the barking. She saw the chaos. She remembered, and in her innocence, she revealed what adults tried to obscure. The defense would have you believe her words are meaningless. But ask yourselves, why would a child fabricate recognition of a dog she should have no memory of? Why did she flinch when she saw him? Why did her eyes fill with fear? Because the truth of that night is carved into her memory. He walked slowly toward the defense table, his gaze resting briefly on Mercer. The defendant would like you to believe he is the victim here. But the evidence, the surveillance footage, and yes, even the smallest voice in this courtroom, tell us otherwise. The victim was a child. The victim was innocence stolen by fear. And today, you have the power to return some measure of justice. Samuel's voice dropped, soft but resolute. Do not dismiss her words because of her age. Do not let technicalities blind you to truth. Sometimes, truth is clearest in the voice of the innocent. He stepped back, his closing complete. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint scratching of jurors' pens. Then Richard Cole stood. His tie was loosened, his face pale, but his eyes still burned with defiance. He addressed the jury with a mixture of desperation and defiance. "Members of the jury," he began, "you are here to decide a man's fate. Not to indulge in sentiment, not to be swayed by theatrics. Yes, a child pointed at a dog and said 2 words. But she is 3 years old. 3. She cannot tell truth from imagination. She cannot distinguish memory from nightmare. You cannot convict a man based on the fragile mind of a toddler." He slammed his hand against the table for emphasis. "The prosecution wants you to believe this case is simple. But it is not. It is built on shadows, half-truths, and assumptions. You saw the footage grainy, unclear, ambiguous. Could it have been a child? Perhaps. Could it have been something else? Absolutely. Reasonable doubt hangs over this case like a storm cloud, and you must acknowledge it." Cole's voice rose. "Do not let sympathy cloud your judgment. Do not let the emotional power of a child's innocence blind you to the possibility of error. My client deserves the same protection under the law as anyone else. And unless the state has proven his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, you must find him not guilty." His words hung in the air, defiant but hollow. He returned to his seat, beads of sweat visible on his brow. The judge dismissed the jury to deliberate. The room exhaled collectively as the 12 men and women filed into the deliberation chamber. Hours passed. Reporters outside broadcasted live updates. Inside, the tension grew unbearable. Evelyn rocked Maddie gently, humming to calm both herself and the child. Samuel sat at his table, staring at the floor, replaying every moment in his mind. Cole whispered furiously to Mercer, though both men looked increasingly resigned. Finally, as the evening shadows lengthened across the room, the jury returned. The air grew thick with anticipation. Everyone rose as the foreperson stood, a folded piece of paper trembling in her hand. "Madam Foreperson," Judge Whitaker said, "has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." The clerk took the paper, unfolded it, and read aloud. On the charge of aggravated assault and resisting arrest, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. The words struck like a bell, tolling in the stillness. Gasps filled the gallery. Mercer's shoulders sagged. His face crumpled, rage and despair mingling as bailiffs moved swiftly to restrain him. His lawyer sank back into his chair, his fight extinguished. Samuel closed his eyes briefly, a wave of relief washing over him. Justice messy, painful, imperfect had been served. But the moment that mattered most was not the verdict. It was the soft sigh of Evelyn as she held Maddie close, tears slipping down her cheeks. The child looked up at her grandmother, confused by the eruption of noise and emotion. "Is it over, Nana?" she whispered. Evelyn kissed her forehead. "Yes, baby. It's over." Reporters would later write that the trial was decided by evidence, testimony, and law. But those who sat in that room knew better. It was decided the moment a 3-year-old girl pointed at a police dog and spoke. 2 words that carried more weight than any lawyer's argument. "Doggy bad." Those words echoed in the minds of the jurors long after they left the courthouse. They echoed in the conscience of Officer Daniels, who vowed never again to overlook a small shadow in a dangerous alley. They echoed in Samuel Green's career, reminding him that truth sometimes arrived in the smallest packages. And they echoed in Evelyn's heart, a bittersweet reminder of her granddaughter's resilience. For Maddie, the memory would fade slowly, softened by time and love. But the world around her would not forget. The story of the toddler who shifted the course of justice became more than a headline. It became a reminder that innocence, even when fragile, holds a power all its own. And so, in a courtroom where law and truth had wrestled bitterly, it was not the seasoned attorneys, nor the decorated officers, nor the stern judge who delivered the final blow. It was a child, whose voice small, pure, and unyielding spoke the truth that no one else could. A truth that left everyone stunned. A truth that changed everything.